Now that we've reviewed some behavior basics, we are going to get into the specifics of the key components of an FBA. Please remember as we move through the rest of this course that an FBA is a systematic process through which educators seek to find the why behind an interfering behavior. Many times we can utilize low intensity strategies and resources to address student behavior before needing to move to an FBA. But sometimes it is important to complete a full FBA. When those earlier strategies fail, or if the behavior is extreme, then it would call for completing a full FBA, which is what we're going to talk about now. Most of the resources utilized on this section come from the Iris Center from Vanderbilt. The link will be included in the resources at the end of this course. Remember that a high quality FBA benefits students and educators by respecting student dignity. When we assume that the interfering behavior is meeting a need and isn't just a bad kid, quote unquote, then an FBA team is able to not place the blame on the student and instead continue the process through a lens of meeting the need that the function of the behavior serves. This helps us keep in the mindset that we're not trying to fix the student, blame the student, point fingers, but instead determine what's going on and identify replacement behaviors if necessary, supports, interventions that will be effective to meet the student's needs. Additionally, a high quality FBA would benefit students and educators by guiding instruction. FBAs can usually help identify the underlying skill deficits that might contribute to an interfering behavior, which tells us what we need to teach the student. Rather than just trying everything we can get really specific into the skills the student actually needs, whether they be academic, social, or communication. And finally, a high quality FBA benefits students and educators by informing more effective interventions. Again, the more information we have gathered through a quality process like an FBA will help the team design interventions and a behavior plan that addresses the root cause of the interfering behavior. We're going to be more effective, they're going to be more meaningful, and lasting behavior change will occur when we're able to do these while keeping the function in mind. An important consideration when completing an FBA is about subjectivity because we're humans. And many of the people who are coming to the table to talk about a student and their FBA process have prior interactions with the student, they have prior relationships. And so our goal is to make sure that we are being as objective as possible and really reducing subjectivity within these conversations. It's easy to slip into a pattern of finger pointing or emotion, and that's not going to serve the student best at this time. One of the best ways that you can reduce subjectivity is taking a team approach. An FBA should never be completed by one person. It's best to get information, input, and guidance from a large group of educators, family, students, parents who interact with the child. So, like I said, an FBA is best developed when utilizing a team approach, but it will need a really strong lead for that team. So, having a practitioner and educator who's knowledgeable about the FBA process is really critical. We can do this through a school psychologist leading, a BCBA, somebody who's been through the FBA process before. So, the process itself is not a barrier. They're just focused on serving the student they're talking about best. It's also really important to consider that the student and parent have a voice as a member of the team. It's not to say that a parent needs to be present every time that an FBA team is discussing the child, but it's pretty impossible to determine what the underlying need is if we don't have information about the student when they're outside of school as well. And for many students, getting their own input is really critical to reducing subjectivity. And we want to make sure we are directly addressing any preconceptions about the behavior, any bias we've held previously, including cultural factors, which again, talking to the parent and the student are going to be critical there. What is okay in some cultures is not necessarily acceptable in others. So, making sure that you're considering cultural factors and also parental or familial perception of the behavior is going to give the team more information to support the student in the long run. So, there are some key components in an FBA. The first is that there should be an operational definition of the behavior. And this should be the first thing that the team determines. This is why we put such an emphasis on practicing and understanding what a measurable and observable behavior is and what's one that's not measurable or observable, or may be something that is a little bit more emotional or a character trait. We must have something as operational in order to complete the FBA process. The first section we're going to focus on here is the indirect assessment data. An indirect assessment is something that we will basically like collect. We're going to gather information. This should always be done after we define the behavior operationally. That's our step number one. And then we're going to, as a team, figure out what is all the information that we can collect on this student. Indirect in itself means that we are not requiring a firsthand observation of the target behavior to collect this information. So, in layman's terms, that's going to mean that I'm not doing any additional observations right now to collect indirect assessment data. There are typically three types of indirect assessments: a record review, structured interviews, and rating scales. So, a record review would be cumulative of all the information that we have about the student, things like academic records, attendance, disciplinary data, any office referral forms that you have, health history, nurses' visits, progress monitoring data. If the student is in any sort of special education or have been in an intervention at tier 2 before, we should have some progress monitoring data to look at. Any prior eval results, if they had a speech or language assessment, if they've previously gotten a psychological evaluation, if they have an IEP or a 504 plan. Those are additional information you could utilize. Another really important thing to consider is, have they had an FBA done prior? Because that information is going to be really helpful when developing a new FBA. It's almost like we don't have to start back at the beginning. Or any previous behavior intervention plans, positive behavior support plans, safety plans, that type of information. Bringing it all together can really help us start to understand what services has the student already interacted with. What patterns do we see over time between classroom settings, teachers, schools? Because when we have all that, we can make sure this isn't just a here and now issue, but that we have a broad lens view of what is going on with the student. Structured interviews, on the other hand, are something that would need to be done at real time. So we would basically have a guided conversation with educators who interact with the student, family members, even the student themselves, asking background information specifically related to the target behavior. This should not be to the depth of a full psychological eval, asking specifically about the behavior that we are considering. Possible triggers, antecedents, or consequences or reinforcement that worked or didn't work when talking about this specific behavior. Even trying to ask questions about times of day, places, and activities in which the target behavior is likely to occur. This can be great when you're talking to family, because you might get information that in the world outside of the school setting is really helpful when considering those triggers and antecedents. Also, we can ask about intervention strategies that have worked or have not worked in the past. Structured interviews should really only be about 10 to 30 minutes. Again, these are not to the depth or breadth of a full psychological eval, but just asking questions to the parties that interact with this child the most. Close ended questions that are answered in a yes or no provide limited information. So be careful in how you're wording your questions. And always ensure that you're being culturally sensitive and respectful to the student or the responder's background. When specifically interviewing the student, it's important to think about their developmental ability, age, attention span. You might ask a reduced number of questions or simplify the language, allowing the student to select responses rather than having to ideate or generate a response. And even incorporating visual stories or role play could be utilized here. If at any time the student displays distress or escalating behavior, the interview should, of course, be stopped. The goal here is not to trigger or intensify any student behavior or damage any relationships that already have been developed with the student. And then the last type of indirect assessment is a rating scale. Many of the teachers have utilized these for other tasks in their role. So, knowing it might be like a Likert scale of a 1 to 5, how often something occurs, never, sometimes, often, always, even a yes or no. You might be asked to gauge how often the target behavior occurs in certain settings or following certain events, or if it results in a certain outcome. So, keeping in mind that again, this rating scale should be developed specifically about the behavior we are addressing through this FBA. Not every behavior the child has ever exhibited or could ever exhibit. We're narrowing in and zooming in on this specific behavior. Keep in mind that FBA teams should be aware that there are limitations to indirect assessments. These are subjective assessments. They're based on a wide variety of input, which is helpful to reduce that subjectivity. But again, we are all human and have emotions and biases. And therefore, we shouldn't draw conclusions from these indirect assessments alone. So, going back to those key components of the FBA, we've talked about operationally defining the behavior, we've talked about indirect assessment data, and now we're going to talk about direct observational data. Sometimes this is called a descriptive assessment. I tend to use the term direct observation because that's what it looks like in practice. And so this is basically another way to gather information about the student. Ideally, this should be performed by an objective person. So if a teacher who is in the classroom where the child is exhibiting the behavior is asked to collect ABC or direct observation data, that's really tough to do objectively. One, because you're going to be distracted by all the other little beings who are in that classroom. Two, it's hard to remove your bias because this child is exhibiting the behavior in your setting. So, a good guiding decision is to not have it be a teacher who's responsible for that student's instruction or other students' instruction at the time. A great time to utilize an expert would be in this direct observation, a school psychologist, a BCBA, any educator who maybe is less familiar with the student but has behavioral expertise could come in with a different lens and viewpoint and get some really objective data collected during this time. A school counselor is another one if they haven't met with the student extensively. During this time, you'll basically be creating that ABC data chart, the antecedent behavior consequence lens. So, asking the student to, or I'm sorry, not asking the student is just performing their everyday normal tasks, and the person who's completing the assessment would enter into that setting and, with as little fanfare or attention brought to them as possible, observe the student and see what goes on and determine, okay, if the setting is a small group reading practice or stations, when they see the behavior, document the A, the antecedent, and then the C, the consequence. And our goal is to get this happening more than once. Not that we're going to purposely trigger the student in any way, but if you only see the behavior one time, it's hard to determine whether that was a fluke or something that wouldn't normally have occurred with the student, or if it's something that truly is a pattern. When you are collecting data, it can be qualitative, which means that we're using words, stories, or quantitative, which means we're actually using numbers, data, time. Um, Having both of this is really great because then we can say that we have the information about the behavior and how it impacts others, but we also have the numbers and the data, which is always going to be great to drive your decision making. Data can be collected in frequency, which is how many times the behavior happens in a given period. It can be in duration, which is how long the behavior lasts. Interval recording is basically saying in a 30-minute period or a 30-second period, does the behavior occur or not? Latency recording is how much time elapses between when an instruction is provided and when the behavior ends or begins or ends. So there's different ways we can talk about data. I think most teachers are most familiar with frequency and duration. And again, our goal is not to determine everything about what's going on with the student, but we're focusing on one specific behavior that was already operationally defined. There might be times that you go in to try to observe a student and that behavior doesn't occur. So this might be a process that takes some starting and stopping, but it's worth it to have once you complete the process and have a direct observation of the behavior. So we've talked about how an FBA should have operationally defined the behavior. We're collecting indirect assessment data. We're conducting a direct observation. And then our last step is going to be to craft a hypothesis statement. And we are actually going to work on that in the next module. So will be the end of this module. What will come next is how we use all that information to develop the hypothesis statement as an FBA team.